All right, good morning. Good morning. Got all the buttons pushed. Everything's working now. Hopefully. Let me double check. Yes, I think so. All right, so we've been talking about redemption the past couple weeks. We did sort of an overview the first week. Last week we talked about redemption in the what? Anybody remember? No? In the Jubilee. Oh, that's probably because you weren't here. Redemption in the Jubilee. But this week, we're going to talk about redemption in the context of the Passover. Now, redemption, if we will recall, redemption involves a transfer of possession. And when we're talking about the great big picture of things, the grand story of the Bible, right? We can see that humanity is under the possession of sin and death, right? But God has a plan to snatch us back from death, to bring us back to life. And that action is called redemption. He wants to redeem us. But how does that redemption actually work is the question. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at how it worked through the Jubilee, about how generational poverty was not a thing under that system. Because just because your parents were poor didn't necessarily mean that you were poor, because if they had to sell their land off to somebody else, every 50 years, your family got a new opportunity to start over, because the land was transferred back into the possession of the rightful owners, the people, the clans that it was assigned to when they came into the land. That's one way redemption works. And so I want to continue to sort of explore that idea of how that works in the Hebrew Bible. I don't mean to get too far lofty. We talked about this last time, about how language is a way for us to express how we understand the world around us. And how what we find when we look at language objectively is that language uses words that we can, relate to, right? You'll find words in any language. You'll find that the words try to find some relatable thing to the thing they're trying to describe. Right? They will then use that relatable thing to describe some new thing, right? So that we can understand the idea of the concept, right? This is the same metaphor I used last Sunday, right? Is how do we, even the word understand, I'm standing under something, means I'm holding it up, I'm holding this idea up. That's a spatial metaphor, right? I stand, I'm standing, that's very tangible. I know what that is. Underneath something, I know what that means. So if something is standing under something like this board here, I understand what that means. It's holding this idea up. Now, we can metaphorically talk about a lot of other things. And in this case, we're talking about redemption. And we can talk about them in a way that we can appreciate the meaning and the idea of what we are standing under. And what I mean by that is, when I say redemption, I'm no longer talking about going to the store and getting a gallon of milk and redeeming my coupon, right? I'm not just doing that. Now God is redeeming man from sin and death. So metaphor is taking the language from one realm, from the physical experience, and applying it to some abstract reality. And that's what we're doing this morning. We're creating a bridge between two things. Notice what I did there? Bridge is a physical thing I can go walk over, right? but I'm abridging these two ideas, two things that come together. And that's what the word metaphor does. Meta, which is sort of like across, and for, which is a carrying. If you think of those, you ever seen those history shows where they show the shipwrecks and they have the Greek amphora, those big jars that had wine in them and things like that? For means to carry. Amphora was a jar to carry things in. All right, so the idea that we're going to carry meaning with this morning, the thing that's doing the carrying is the Passover. So we talked about the Jubilee year, and we talked about how in the Jubilee year, God says, this land is mine. The Israelites are mine. These are the people that I brought out of Egypt. And so the Exodus out of Egypt is the reason for the Jubilee practice, right? It's release. The land is being released back to its rightful owners, just like the people were released. And now we're into the actual Exodus story itself, right? Because it's the same idea. They also, so if Jubilee is representative of the people being released, they also had another major celebration. You might even say the most major celebration in their history, to remind themselves that God instituted to remind them of their release out of Egypt. And that celebration is probably one of the most recognized celebrations in the world. It is the longest continually celebrated holy day in the history of the world, right? It's still celebrated today, 4,000 years later, 4,000. It depends on how you count it. And it does, we talked about the meaning of the word redemption and how there was an exchange of value sometimes that went along with that. Passover does refer to something of value being exchanged, right? In connection with being liberated from Egypt. And that thing of value in this case is the Passover lamb. And I hope last Sunday's lesson made things clear for you about redemption. And the idea of redemption being the transfer of ownership, especially the first lesson that we did. I hope that really made it clear for you, because this Sunday we're going to make things a bit messy again, because life is never that clean. I mean, it's my job to sit up here and tell you that this is the way things are and they're easy, but that's just not the way life is. We're going to make things messy again, because we're going to make things messy so that we can bring greater clarity once we get through the mess to the other side. All right, so let's start in Exodus. We read from Exodus 13. Thank you, Mr. Jessel, for that. But let's start back in chapter 12 now, because this is where the actual Exodus comes around, and this is where we have the instructions for the Passover as well. Let's do a quick history, though, real quick. Exodus chapter 1, Pharaoh saw the people being fruitful and multiplying and filling the land. Man, that sounds familiar. That's all the way back from Genesis chapter 2, 1 and 2, right? God tells the people, go be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. And this is what they're doing here in Exodus chapter 1, verse 7, right? They're doing these things. And Pharaoh sees these things. And he sees that these people have this blessing from the Garden of Eden. And instead of seeing a chance to partner with those people, right, and get in on the abundance, right, like Joseph's day, the Pharaoh partnered with him, right, and got in on the blessing that he knew Joseph had. This Pharaoh decides that he wants to take the blessing for himself. Do you see how that works? Because Genesis chapter 1, you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. Right? Genesis chapter 1 and 2. What happens in Genesis chapter 3? Adam and Eve see the fruit of the tree that they're not supposed to take. The snake convinces them, lies to them, and says, oh, did he really say that? Oh, it's all right. They see it, they take it for themselves because they want it for themselves. They want the knowledge of good and evil so they can be like God, it says. It's the same language here that Pharaoh is using. He saw a fruitful and multiplying people who are filling his land, and he said, no, I can't have this. These immigrants, they can't be getting more fruitful than my people. So like in Joseph's day, he decides to take advantage of those people, right? Just like Eve and Adam, Pharaoh saw, he took, and that leads him to enslave the Israelites. Right? And he finally, to stop this increase in this blessing for them, to try and take it for himself, he gives a decree to start killing the sons of Israel. I want you to remember that, because when we think about Passover and we think about the sons of Egypt dying, we have to remember this is about stopping killing. Passover is about stopping killing. It's not about more people dying, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But Pharaoh is led to enslaving the Israelites. He gives a decree to start killing the sons of Israel. And because he didn't want these immigrants to become too big of a population, right? Because they might take over. And so he decides to enslave them and slowly kill them off while extracting as much value in labor as he can get from them. He sees them like labor animals, right? And so the killing of the sons of Israel by Pharaoh is something that God takes very seriously. And so in our history, we've moved from chapter 1 now to chapter 4, and God commissions Moses at the burning bush to go and confront Pharaoh and to say to Pharaoh, right? Exodus chapter 4, in verse 22, and you will say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn. I told you, let my son go that he may worship me, but you refuse to let him go. Look, I am about to kill your firstborn son. A life for a life. And we might be tempted, like I was saying, we might be tempted to hear this and be like, man, that's a very vengeful God. You know, he's just killing people that kill everybody else. But the point is not vengeance. The point is that this is fair. The word that we were using this morning was restitutional judgment. But when you kill somebody, there is no restitution that you can make to restore that person. And so this is a different word that's used. This is recompense, paying you back for killing. God says, you're killing my sons. If you don't let my son go, and you're going to keep taking the lives of my sons, then I'm going to take your son's life. That's the warning. And God even gives them 10 chances, right, to let them go. But Pharaoh doesn't do it. God doesn't just go and kill his sons. He gives them many opportunities. So after these 10 refusals, right, that lead to the ruin of Egypt, then God says, okay, I'm done with the 10 chances. It's time to take a life. And And so this is the night of Passover. This is what we're talking about. In Israel, every family is supposed to go and select a blameless lamb, one that's unblemished. And that's the word tamim. It's going to become important later on. Not today, but in other days. Tamim, unblemished, whole, complete. Not the lamb with its back leg cut off that you're not any good anyway. Use something good. And the blood that they're supposed to smear on the doorposts, we'll get to that in a second. That blood is the life of the animal. That blood represents life. And that life is painted on the doorposts, the door frames of every house. And now we're back to Exodus chapter 12, right? In verse 23. When the Lord passes through to strike Egypt and sees the blood on the lintel of the two doorposts, he will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter your houses to strike you. Okay. Sounds pretty simple there. The Hebrew word there for pass over your house is the word pesach. He will pesach over the door. And he won't allow the destroyer to enter your house and to strike it. Small little problem here in that there's a puzzle here in the Hebrew. The literary design of this verse is very significant because that last line, what does the opening line say? Verse 23, when the Lord passes through to strike Egypt. Okay, what does the last line say? He will not let the destroyer enter your houses and strike you. Uh-oh. There's a little puzzle here. Because you're like, wait, who's striking the house? I thought God was coming in. And then he says he's going to hold back this destroyer. And that's sort of the whole puzzle here about the meaning of the word Passover and what's going on. Because this verse is very crucial. And this is one of the main points of the lesson here. Is that the picture that we're trying to see here, the picture that this passage is trying to paint for us, is that Yahweh is allowing some destroying force or some agent to go through the land. The problem is he sort of tipped his hand and said that Yahweh is the one who's orchestrating this thing. It's Yahweh striking the land. But the thing that's actually doing the striking is distinct from Yahweh, the Lord. He is the destroyer. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. We're going to move on now. He is Yahweh, but he's separate from Yahweh. But wherever there's blood on the door, Yahweh will pesach over that door. So in other words, the Lord is also the defender of the house. He's the destroyer, but he's also the defender of the house. He's protecting the house from the destroyer. Notice, though, this has nothing to do with our lesson. The word redeem has not been used. So how do we get redemption out of this? How do we get redemption out of this? Right? Well, right here in the telling of this story is how the Israelites were being released. Right? There is a life for a life exchange going on here. But it's different than how I buy milk from the store, right? This is not necessarily I'm paying the person who owns the store, right? Nobody's paying Pharaoh. So let's look at the messy part of the lesson this morning. The Lord is bringing life. He's bringing a life for a life. He's bringing that to bear on the land of Egypt. I want us to think about the flood waters. Think about Noah and the flood waters, right? The destroyers, he's just going through this whole land. But not everybody in the land is guilty, right? Well, maybe. The death of these Israelite sons. I want us to think about this, because this is a moral conundrum. If God is going through the land and just killing all the firstborn sons regardless of their guilt or innocence, that would be bad. That would be a moral quandary that we could hold against God or something. But that's not what's going on, because the death of the Israelite sons means the death of every firstborn in the land. Let's think about this. And if you surrender the life of a lamb, that lamb will stand in place of or in exchange for the life of the firstborn son that's inside of that house. Whether they're Israelite or Egyptian. And this is the key here, right? Because it's underneath the text, but it's still there in the text, that the Egyptians participated in this Passover. Did you know that? Whether they were Israelite or Egyptian, this Passover applied to them. And so if the logic is life for a life, I will admit, even life for a life tends to be uncomfortable for us. Because if I took someone's life, it's their life. I can't give it back to them. What could I really give to pay back for that? Think about Noah and our example of Noah again. After the flood, God says to Noah in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6. He says, the one who sheds the blood of humans, how's it go? By humans, his blood will be shed. Because why? Anybody remember? We always remember the eye for an eye, the life for a life part. Why, though? Genesis chapter 9. Read it real quick. Why is it life for life? Huh? Not life is in the blood. That's not what he says. Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6. Because we are... Yes, because we are images, because we're made in his image. The one who sheds blood, by humans his blood will be shed, because God made humans in his image. So the image of God means that every human life has a sacred value. It's in relation to the value of God's life. It's equal to the value of the life of God. Do you see that? How much emphasis God is putting on this? God's life, that's his ultimate value. He is the creator and sustainer of life. Our lives have value in relation to that. That is amazing. And so, a human who illegitimately takes the life of another person has forfeited his own life. And I've already mentioned it during Bible class, but notice that there is no sacrifice in the Torah for murder. So God's way of distinguishing the innocent person from the guilty is by inviting the innocent person to do something. right? Like plague number 7, the hail, right? God tells Moses to give a warning to any Israelite or Egyptians. Stay inside, because there's going to be hail. Anybody who takes the word of the Lord seriously, get in your house. That's plague number 7, the hail. And what you're told is that many Israelites went into their house. What we're also told, though, is that many Egyptians also went into their house. And so here now is another strike, the 10th strike. And all of a sudden, houses are the refuge here. And so we're gonna see in a few chapters how Israel, or I should say, in a few chapters we're going to see how many Egyptians went with the Israelites out into the desert to worship God. Did you know that? To participate with Israel. We also find out how many people participated in Passover. And so in chapter 13, which Jessel read for us, there's this clarification about what non-Israelites in your house, what they're supposed to do during Passover. And God says they're part of the household. They're covered by the blood that's on the door. What do? The implicit and very clear point here is that many Egyptians participated in the Passover. We think of this as being a strictly Jewish sort of thing. But it's right there in the text. He gave instructions for what these people were supposed to do, the people who are non-Israelites. And so God's way of distinguishing between innocent and guilty here isn't the way of distinguishing the innocent and the guilty is to give the gift, that is the offer of the firstborn lamb, as a symbol. The firstborn lamb, that gift that God will accept. Because God's the one telling Israel to do this, so that the lamb, and especially the blood of the lamb now, is standing in the gap, so that the firstborn child of that house doesn't get taken by the plague. God will see to that himself. He will protect this house from the destroyer. And so what does that mean for Israel, though? Verse 11, chapter 13, verse 11. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, you are to present the Lord every firstborn male of the womb. All the firstborn offspring of the livestock you own that are males will be the Lord's. You must redeem every firstborn of a donkey with a flock animal. But if you do not redeem it, break its neck. However, you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. You can't go just break their necks, right? Life for life. In the future, when your son asks, what does this mean? Say to him, by the strength of his hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go. The Lord killed every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, but the firstborn of humans and the firstborn of livestock. That is why I sacrifice to the Lord all the firstborn of the womb that are males, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons. So let it be a sign on your hand and as a symbol on your forehead, for the Lord brought us out of Egypt by the strength of his hand. When Yahweh brings us out of the land into the land of the Canaanites, right? Remember, that land that belongs to Yahweh, that land, you will hand over the first offspring of your womb to Yahweh. Whether it's a domestic animal or those sorts of things. And here's our word. Every firstborn among your sons, you must what? Redeem them. And so the idea is that because of what happened on Passover, their lives actually belong to the Lord. He brought them out of Egypt. They belong to him. And then verse 14, when your son, whose life is now, when your son, whose life asks you in the future, what was that all about, right? When you have your firstborn child, God actually isn't going to demand the sacrifice of that child. That's not the God of the Bible, right? But there is some sort of reality where you don't actually possess that child because God blessed you with that child. Ultimately, that child belongs to God. And so you're going to enact this ritual in which you will give me an animal instead, right? God says. And that's you redeeming your son. And this is the idea that God wants a parent to see that their child is being on loan to them. Your children are on loan to you. And we can see that even as parents, right? We raise them up and then they go. They're not ours anymore. They paid off that loan. They're gone. 98% of the time you will spend with your children is before they are 18. 98% of the time you will spend with your children is before they are 18. They're only on loan to you for a few years. I hope you're hearing echoes also here of Abraham, right, and Isaac, about God providing the ram in place of Isaac. Because here's where the rubber meets the road. God is the one who gives life. And when we humans, we scheme and we do what is right in our own eyes, when we try to own each other literally through slavery, through indentured servitude, through whatever label we want to put on it, sweatshop, right? To try and rule over each other with violence, with greed, when we take each other's lives, God will, at some point in time, like the flood, do one of these decreation moments on the earth. Now, he has promised us not to do it with water, but he has also promised us to do it with fire. Right? Eventually, God will hand over people to their own destructive elements, to their own ruin. It's like creation itself is rebelling when it rains for 40 days and 40 nights, right? I want you to hear the echo of Paul in Romans chapter 8 here, when he says, even the creation cries out. You see, the problem is that we humans, we act like our lives don't belong to God, right? And we do all sorts of stupid stuff to each other, and God says, listen, your lives, they belong to me. And so either we can make that clear by you dying, but I don't want the humans to die, right? God says. I want humans to live, because that's the whole point of the Eden ideal, was to what? Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That's what God wants for us to do. He doesn't want us to die. And so he sends a ransom, a payment, a substitute for us. And the life of that animal is God giving something of value to us that we can give back to him. And so that also makes clear that my life belongs to God. But now the life I have from God, I can see now that my life is on loan. And I hope that for you this morning, that changes your whole outlook on life. That your life is on loan. It always has been on loan, if you just realize that now. Believe it or not, it always has been on loan to you. But we don't always act like that. But going through the Passover for the Israelites showed them, it taught them to recognize that their life was on loan from God. The life of my family is on loan. And then I do this symbol, the symbolic night of ritual. I surrender this life of this animal. And I'm theoretically changed by this experience as an Israelite. And this is all part of how the Bible works. How the Hebrew Bible's messianic story, how it works. And this is the network of ideas that Jesus was pointing to when he says, the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to be a servant. To give his life as a lutron on the behalf of the many. Some Bibles translate that as sacrifice. Some Bibles translate that as a redemption. God gave his life as a redemption on the behalf of the many, of the world. So I think why, at least I get hung up a little bit, is in trying to really understand the logic of the Passover. Sometimes we get hung up because the firstborns of Israel were never at fault. At least that's how we sometimes try and think about it when we think about this logically. In case you didn't read the Old Testament, that has never been true. The truth is actually quite different. But the point of the story is they are the ones that God is rescuing, right? It was really Pharaoh and Egypt underneath the rule of Pharaoh that they're being rescued from. And later in the Bible, Pharaoh becomes like this snake and like death for Israel, like sin and death in the garden. And so all of life outside of Eden, outside of the garden, is under this wrongful possession of sin and death. We are enslaved to sin and death, to the snake and death. Sometimes that snake comes in the form of Pharaoh. Maybe it's a little bit easier to point out who the snake is in this case. But I want you to remember, why is Israel in Egypt? Why are they in Egypt? Because they're the ones that need rescuing, right? Why are they in Egypt? It's because their own brothers betrayed their brother and sold him into slavery. They almost murdered him. And so I don't want us to forget that Israel's, even their greatest ancestor that they point to, who is what? Abraham, right? That Abraham and his wife were actually the first ones to oppress an Egyptian slave and make her a slave, right? That's Abraham and Sarah, how they oppress Hagar, right? So when you get to Exodus, Pharaoh does what the Israelites were doing. They're both wrong, and they're both a sad result to the end of a network of whole bad decisions that the Israelites have been doing to each other and to the Egyptians. Everybody's wronging everybody in the whole story here. Everyone's complicit. And so when Paul says in the New Testament, he says, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory. And so there's a flood coming, essentially, is what he's saying. There's a flood of justice that's coming. And you're going to have this life for a life concept. We are all guilty in many different ways. We are all complicit in the taking of life, right? And what does Paul say? That the payment is? The wages of sin is death. So if we jump back to the story here of the Exodus, we have this message coming to us, this wisdom that we can take out of this event that happened in the Torah. We can get this wisdom out of this instruction out of it. Because he says, but there is a way through. God offers us a way through sin and death to the other side where life is. He offers us a substitute, right? A means of exchange. He's up there thinking, you all owe me your lives. And you have illegitimately participated in these systems that take each other's lives, that enslave each other. Everyone is acting like a Pharaoh. And so you're all going to die. And then that night of Passover is good news because they're not going to die. That's what's so hard for us to hear. We feel like, why is God killing all these innocent people? That's what we think. Innocent firstborns, why are they dying? But I think we're missing the logic of what's going on here in the scriptures. God gave us many chances, right? Many chances. And even the 10th one, the Passover, is a chance to get out of the consequences. You just have to obey God and put the blood on the doorposts. If you remember back in chapter 4, God says, Israel as a whole is my firstborn, right? It's referred to as this redemption. So just like the slave, the Israelite slave is redeemed on the 7th year, just like the land is redeemed on the 7 times 7th year, 49th, 50th year, Jubilee, so the life of the firstborn has to be redeemed on the 7th day. Right? The land belongs to me, says Yahweh. But I give it to you as temporary caretakers. And Jesus mirrors that in the New Testament when he says the sons of man didn't come to be, the Son of Man did not come to be like Pharaoh. He didn't come to be a Pharaoh-like Lord, oppressing and ruling over the nations like people do. He came to be a servant, to give his life as a means of redemption for the whole world. And so Yahweh himself comes and he becomes human to offer his life in place of the people whom he already possesses, but that have come under the possession of sin and death. They have refused his possession. They have walked away from him and said, nope, I'd like sin over here. I'd like death instead. They've come under the authority of Pharaoh. And so instead of making those humans surrender their own lives physically, Yahweh will come and surrender over the life of his own son. There's a reason why Jesus locked in on this story. We'll talk about that another day, another week. I want to chase one last rabbit this morning and talk about how redeemed people should act. Because I've heard and seen some really embarrassing things here in town and on social media around the country, especially from people who claim to be followers of Christ. And it comes in reference to people who are different than us, different than our culture, whether they're Muslims, whether they're immigrants. I've seen some very horrific things said and done in the last few weeks burning a Quran in front of a group of praying Muslims, mocking them by throwing bacon at them and yelling at them nonstop while they're praying, while at the same time trying to say that Jesus is the true one to follow. You can't act like that, and because that's nothing but hate that is masquerading around as righteousness. And it's not how we Christians need to approach sharing the gospel with anyone. Because Jesus, he loved the Egyptians. He loved the Samaritans. He loved the tax collectors, the zealots, the idol worshipers. He even loved those people who persecuted him. The religious hypocrites of his day, he loved them. The prostitutes, and those people who were enslaved by their own sins. Right? He loved them enough to try and tell them and impress upon them who he is and the fact that he can set them free. Why we need to do like he did. Why don't we do as he does? Why not show them how great Jesus is? I think, or I don't think, I'm afraid, I fear that sometimes we're like Simon, the Pharisee. Right? I can't see how bad my sin is. I stand up and I pray, "Oh Lord, I'm so wonderful. I'm glad I'm not like this Pharisee over here, or like I'm so glad I'm not like this person over here who's a sinner." I can't see my own sin as bad sometimes. I was raised as this religious person, so those people over there, they're far worse than me. But the truth is that they, just like us, have a debt that we cannot pay. This is the whole idea of redemption, right? That you will only find redemption through Jesus. You will only find redemption through his sacrifice, through his love at the cross. He is the way. He is the truth. He is the life. And no one comes to the Father except through him. We need to start acting like that in our daily lives. And we need to correct when people say things and do things in Jesus' name that makes us look bad. We need to make sure that people know this is not the way of Jesus. That's what it means to live as a redeemed person now in our lives. Is to go out there and show the love of Christ. Not to take a leaf blower and blow sand on people who are praying on a beach. Right? That's what it means to live as a redeemed person. Is to stand up for what is true and what is right. That's the lesson this morning. Next week we'll look at different aspect of redemption further along in the story. It's good to have everybody here this morning. We'll see you all next week. Let's grab our songbooks. Somewhere I have a songbook.